So due to the present circumstances, the Seward House Museum is actually closed to the public. But the good news is we're able to give you a behind-the-scenes tour as we explore the history looking at this house. Now welcome virtually to the Seward House Museum. My name is Zach Finn and I'm the Education Outreach Coordinator here. And as we walk through this historic house, we're going to explore topics of abolition, the Underground Railroad, what political history was like during the 19th century, who the Secretary of State was during Abraham Lincoln's presidency. You might not know any of these answers at the start of the tour, but as we move room to room, you'll all be experts on Seward family by the end of this virtual tour. Now, first let me introduce you to the space and the house we're standing in. So behind me is the original doors of the house when it's first constructed in 1816. Now, normally when the school groups visit the site here, one of my initial warnings as we're talking about the rules is to make sure to stay together as a group, as there are over 33 rooms to get lost in this space at this moment. Now, obviously, as you'll be following me virtually, we don't have to worry about anyone wandering off. But if you're to visit in 1816, there's not going to be 33 rooms. There's not even going to be in total a third of that amount, as this house was originally 10 rooms when it's first constructed. And this would be the main doorway here. And if you were to visit in 1816, you would knock on those doors. You would hope that you timed your visit well, and a family servant might greet you and then escort you into the Seward family parlor, which is what we're going to do. Here we are standing in the Seward family parlor. One of those original rooms in this house is first constructed in 1816, and a very important room as we explore the 19th century. Now you have to think, during this time, there's no Snapchatting, there's no emails, there's no texting. Really the only way to get to know someone would be writing a letter, which you don't know if they're going to have a chance to read it, or by paying a face-to-face visit to the house. And that's what this room was used for entertaining social callers as they look to impress the Seward family. So these social callers would make their way through the front door, they would be brought into this space, and they could expect to spend around 10 or 15 minutes with the family as they're making their introductions, or perhaps carrying conversation on from earlier. Now these visitors are looking to leave a lasting impression of the Sewards. That's why they're paying this social call. And in the same way that these visitors are looking to leave a good impression on the Sewards are looking to do the same thing with this room. It's why when you're showing around, you see so much ornate artwork, why everything is so decorated, gilded, and gold, and why many of the artifacts display the Seward family worldness from their travels all over. We have a center table from Japan, Italian statues, furniture from Washington, D.C. Surrounding the walls here. This was a room meant to impress visitors. And these social callers, the Sewards hoped that when these social callers made their way, their next social caller made their way back home, that they wouldn't be able to forget the time spent in the Seward family parlor. Now, seeing as this is a room of historic introductions, this is where we like introducing the historic figures we'll be talking about throughout our virtual tour today, starting with the man who built this house in 1816, Elijah Miller. You can see Elijah Miller to my right here. So when he built this house in 1816, just to give you an idea of how old this space is, Auburn had only been chartered as a village for a year at this point. So this house is essentially as old as Auburn, the community was, although there had been people living there for quite some time before. When Elijah Miller began building this house, he had made most of his money through land speculation, which allows him to build one of the first brick buildings here in Auburn. But he's not alone as this house goes up. He's accompanied by two daughters, Lizette Miller and Frances Miller, who you can see next to me here. Now, when Lizette and Frances arrive at Auburn, their father wants to make sure they receive an education equal and comparable to anything any young male is going to receive during this time. This is quite a difficult task. It actually requires them to attend 3 separate schools throughout their lives. First, Frances and Lizette would attend a local school here in Auburn, then a Quaker school in Aurora, and lastly, they attend the Troy Female Seminary, which is doing something extremely unique during this time. They are training young women as if they were young men. And as we move throughout the house today, as we're talking about the 19th century, historians remember it as a time of great inequality. The institution of slavery was being practiced. There wasn't equal access to education nor rights between men and women. And Elijah Miller knew this, so he wanted to make sure his daughters received an education equal to anything any young male is going to receive during this time. And similarly, Francis and Lizette would find themselves involved in the fight for equality. Francis would spearhead using this house as a stop on the Underground Railroad during the 1850s. She was very much an abolitionist. And what that word means is an abolitionist is someone who wanted to see the end to the institution of slavery immediately and through any means. So Francis wants slavery to end, and in her fight against this institution, she uses this house as a stop on the Underground Railroad. She'll help peripherally fight for the right for women, very much involved in these progressive movements that are occurring during the 19th century. Now, it's while attending the Troy Female Seminary that she meets Cornelia Seward, eventually visiting Cornelia Seward in Florida, New York, which is where she's introduced to this museum's namesake, and also her future husband, William Henry Seward here. Now, Seward's upbringing is very similar to Francis's. His father is quite wealthy, allows him to invest in Seward's education, and Seward, just like Francis, is a natural scholar. He enjoys reading, he enjoys writing, he enjoys studying, and during this, he ends up attending Union College, graduating in good standing, and then he makes a visit to Auburn looking to ask Francis out on a date, but not before he becomes a practicing lawyer. And as luck would have it, Judge Elijah Miller was now working as opening a law firm, and he happened to be looking for a junior partner. So Seward begins working with Elijah Miller. Within a year, he's asking to marry Francis. And when Seward approaches Elijah Miller, the only way he'll agree to this proposal is that for as long as he's alive, they stay in the Auburn residence with him. So shortly after, Seward and Francis will be married. They move into the Auburn home here, and it would stay their home for the rest of their lives. Now, when most of our visitors stop by the Seward House Museum, they're not really familiar with Seward the lawyer. They're familiar with Seward the political figure. And Seward, throughout his political career, will serve as a New York State Senator, a New York State Governor, a United States Senator, and ultimately Secretary of State. So 4 different offices, and since I know this is one of the questions, I'll go through those again. Seward serves as a New York State Senator, a New York State Governor, a United States Senator, and ultimately a Secretary of State. This is what most of our visitors are familiar with him as a political figure, and much of his success as a politician is thanks to these 2 men behind me, starting with 6th President of the United States, John Quincy Adams, who serves as a political mentor to Seward. Then we have Seward's political advisor, Thurlow Weed, who you can see to my left here. And Thurlow Weed is the perfect political advisor for William Henry Seward. He's someone who knows how the game is played. He can get things done, which is important because Seward can be a controversial political figure. Seward is against the institution of slavery. He's anti-slavery. He supports Irish and Chinese immigration. He supports prison and education reform. These ideals and beliefs can make him a lot of enemies. But while Seward focuses on that policy and trying to make this society a little bit more equal, Thurlow Weed is able to focus on making sure it becomes a reality, really making them quite a formidable team in the 19th century. Now we are going to make our way from a very public space where social callers would be entertained to a very private space which really would have only been seen by the family. And here we are in that private space, the Seward Family Library. Right now you are looking at over 2,000 pieces of evidence that this family really liked to read. And interestingly enough, in the 19th century, print is changing. Now people can actually purchase the books. For really the first time in history, books are available to both the middle and upper middle class. So people are buying books not by the title necessarily, but actually by the square foot, as they're looking to decorate with these books. They're looking to use them as status symbols. But the good thing for us, those of us who work here at the Seward Museum, is that this family is actually engaging with these books. They're not using them as status symbols. These are books that they're using to shape their understanding of the world. So when we want to learn something about the family, we can turn to their letters, we can turn to the journals or some of the books that they author, but we can also turn to this library as a whole and specific books that they're reading. At times, we'll ask our curator to pull a certain title out, if it's mentioned in a letter or perhaps in one of those journals. And she dons these very special gloves to preserve the integrity of this collection. And when she opens these books up, oftentimes there's notes made by the family in the corners. Sometimes there's flowers pressed within. Other times there's sections underlined. This library can really give us an insight into how the family thought during this time in history. Now, most of these books that you've been shown throughout your tour so far are going to be nonfiction titles. These are books that both Frances, Seward, and even Lizette are turning to shape their understanding of the world in this chaotic moment in American history. But there's going to be one special library on display here, which you can see behind the glass case. And this is the library to the Seward's youngest child, Fanny Seward. Now, as a child, Fanny Seward was oftentimes suffering from bouts of ill health. During these bouts of ill health, she would stay here in Auburn, where she would spend time in this library. She would spend time on the grounds, playing with her friends in the gardens. But right when this Matthew Brady photograph is taken, this marks a pivotal time in both Seward's and Fanny's life. Fanny would have been around entering her teenage years at this point, and this is her first chance to really get a chance to explore the world, as she's accompanying her father on a political campaign throughout not only New York, but throughout New England and throughout the Midwest. Interestingly enough, not campaigning for himself or this lifelong politician who holds those four offices. Seward is actually campaigning for the man who had just beaten him as the 1860 Republican presidential nominee, second one that the party had had at this point, Abraham Lincoln. Now, Seward and Fanny and an entourage traveled throughout the United States, rallying the Republican Party behind this relatively unknown political figure at this point. And shortly after the campaign concludes and Abraham Lincoln is elected the 16th President of the United States, the Winter of Secession breaks out, the Civil War looms on the horizon, and Lincoln has to pull together his cabinet. He has to pull together a team to navigate this unprecedented moment in American history. And as he's pulling together his cabinet, working with his own political team, he is approached in Springfield by Thurlow Weed, Seward's political advisor from the last room. And when Thurlow Weed approaches him, Thurlow Weed reminds Lincoln that he's indebted to William Henry Seward for his political campaign. He also highlights Seward's political legacy. He had already served in 3 different political offices at this point in his career. And lastly, he highlights that Seward enjoys traveling the world, which would make him the perfect person to serve as Secretary of State, whose job would be developing good relationships with countries from all over. And Lincoln agrees. He ends up appointing Seward as his Secretary of State, and the two end up spending most of their time in Washington, D.C. together, trying to navigate this moment in American history, with Seward focusing on the foreign policy, making sure it stays a civil war as opposed to an international crisis, and Abraham Lincoln handling domestic issues. These two are quite an impressive team, again, navigating this moment in American history, which there was nothing else to compare it to at this point. Now, their political legacies would be intertwined, as is what would happen following the war's conclusion. When the war ends, Abraham Lincoln will be assassinated by John Wilkes Booth, and that same night, April 14th, Seward will be targeted by one of John Wilkes Booth's conspirators, a Confederate soldier by the name of Lewis Powell. While Seward survives the attack, a year of tragedy befalls this family. First, Seward learns about the passing of his close friend Abraham Lincoln. Shortly after that, his wife Frances would succumb to a series of shocks. And then later that year, just shy of her 22nd birthday, Fanny Seward too would pass away of tuberculosis. And amidst all of this, the death of Fanny stands out to Seward as his great unspeakable sorrow. And looking to preserve his daughter's legacy, he gathers together her most cherished belongings, and being an aspiring author, these things are her books, And he sends them here to Auburn and memorializes Fanny behind this glass case here, preserving her legacy for essentially all time and for all of our visitors. Now, while Seward and Lincoln are working together to navigate this very chaotic time in American history, Seward has a special tool that he turns to make him successful. And if you'll follow me, we're going to see that tool. And here we are in the Seward family dining room, and as I mentioned, this is how Seward gets things done. He becomes renowned by historians as one of the best practitioners of dining room diplomacy in American history. And dining room diplomacy is very much what it sounds like. If Seward needs to convince you to join his side, he's going to invite you to a dinner party. He's going to serve you upwards of 12 courses of food, and naturally, each course of food would be accompanied by another round of drinks. And during these 12 courses of food that are being brought out to you, Seward is going to sit at the head of the table, and he's going to espouse his political beliefs. He's basically going to try to brainwash you to get you to join his side. And when we're looking at dining room diplomacy in Seward's political career, there are really three specific stages that stand out as being of note. The first of which occurs during the 1850s, when Seward is working as a United States Senator. And you have to remember, this is a decade leading up to the American Civil War. And political discourse, or political conversation, is growing increasingly heated. It becomes very difficult to have a public political dispute without it turning to violence, as was the case with Charles Sumner, who is beaten on the floor of the Senate for a speech that he delivers against slavery. So this is the context of the 1850s that Seward has to operate in as a political figure. And realizing that public discourse is going to be very difficult, Seward turns to dining room diplomacy, where he can have people set aside some of their previous held notions and actually get them to engage in political conversation. And Seward, at one point, has Charles Sumner, that radical abolitionist from Massachusetts, at the same table as Jefferson Davis, the future president of the Confederacy, just highlighting how Seward can use dining room diplomacy to jump across partisan lines. Now, after the 1850s end and the Civil War breaks out, again, dining room diplomacy is a key component to Seward's political process. This time, his job is keeping it just that, a civil war, as opposed to an international crisis. So operating as Secretary of State, Seward is inviting foreign ministers to these dining room diplomacy sessions, and he's convincing these international powers to not recognize the Confederacy as a sovereign nation. And because of that, it stages that a civil war, probably Seward's most long-lasting contribution to the war effort. Now, when the war concludes, again, dining room diplomacy is going to be critical to Seward's legacy. When the war ends, Seward survives that assassination attempt and continues on as Secretary of State in the Johnson administration. His role as Secretary of State is significantly different. No longer is he worried about international powers joining the Civil War. That's done, that's over. Now he's worried about where the United States is heading in the future. And Seward is very much an expansionist. He wants to enter the United States into the global economic market. He wants the United States to expand. So throughout his career as Secretary of State, he wants to purchase places like Iceland. He wants to buy Greenland. He wants to buy the Philippines. Seward is targeting these areas that he wants to purchase as he hopes they open up new economic markets in both the Atlantic and the Pacific. Now, none of those that I've mentioned that are panning out for Seward until eventually Seward is approached by a Russian diplomat, Edward D. Stokel, who had been granted permission to sell the Alaska territories from Russia to the United States. Now, the two parties gathered together in the State Department in March of 1867, and eventually the Treaty of Cessions is signed. Here we can see sort of mid-signing that treaty, which sells Alaska from Russia to the United States for $7.2 million. Now, just because Seward's signature is on the Treaty of Cessions, it's not official yet. he still needs to bring this before the United States Senate to get support. And realizing that he is closely linked to President Andrew Johnson, a very unpopular president during his time, and as he's remembered historically, a lot of Seward's contemporaries, a lot of his friends, don't think he's going to be successful in getting this approved. But Seward knows his strengths. So over the next 2 weeks throughout the first 2 weeks of April, Seward hosts 4 major dinner parties in total. He is inviting over all of those senators. He is serving them Alaskan delicacies, seafood caught off the coast of Alaska. It's rumored that he's gifting their wives Alaskan furs, really highlighting how much natural potential Alaska has if it's to be added to the United States. This proves successful. It ends up getting voted through the Senate 37-2, becomes a key component of Seward's political legacy, or what he's remembered for. And by the time he's retired from public office, it is being referred to as Seward's folly, or Seward's mistake. And people are ridiculing Seward for this territorial purchase. They say it's a wasted $7.2 million and the United States will never benefit economically from it until the end of the 19th century when they discover gold in Alaska. And people start reevaluating Seward's legacy a little bit. Maybe he was onto something. Following that, the discovery of oil, its role in geopolitics during the Cold War. The Alaska Purchase, though ridiculed initially as Seward's folly, really becomes a crowning achievement of what Seward's remembered for. Now, of course, Seward is dependent on dining room diplomacy to achieve these goals and these things that he's remembered for. And at the end of these 12 courses of food and 12 rounds of drinks, typically this party would split into 2. Some would hang out at the table with Seward, while others would escape or withdraw to the drawing room, which is what we'll do next. And it's here in the drawing room that we really get to connect to the family on a human or personal level. Although this would oftentimes be used as the backdrop for entertainment, it's also where the family would spend much of its time together. And this is where we like making our introductions to the second generation of the family, starting with Seward's oldest son, Augustus Seward, or Gus as the family refers to him as. Now, Gus Seward is going to be a little bit of a mystery in our story. For a family who leaves behind countless letters, a journal, as they author several books, there's a lot of written sources to get to know this family on a personal level. Now, unfortunately for us, Gus Seward is not much of a writer. He ends up attending West Point, a very prestigious and important military institution, graduates 34th out of his class of 38, so perhaps not sharing the same academic zeal as the rest of his family. But from there, he goes on to serve in the Mexican-American War, which his mother is very much against, the American Civil War and the frontier expansions as a paymaster. And following his time in the Mexican-American War, Gus Seward begins responding much less frequently to letters. So he doesn't really leave behind a paper trail for us to get to understand him. A lot of his correspondence are through telegrams, which are very concise. Not a lot of written sources to get to know Gus Seward as a historic actor. But the good news for us is Seward's second oldest son, Frederick Seward, literally writes a book about himself. So there's a little bit more written sources to get to know Fred Seward with. Here you can see him next to the archway in the house here. Frederick Seward will literally follow in his father's footsteps, becoming the Assistant Secretary of State. Meanwhile, his wife Anna will serve as the premier, meaning the best, Washington, D.C. hostess. And her job would be making sure dining room diplomacy goes on without any issue. Frederick Seward would be there on the night that Seward himself would survive an assassination attempt, as would much of the family. On April 14th, 1865, when John Wilkes Booth made his way to Fort Hill Theater, similarly, Lewis Powell, a former Confederate soldier, made his way to Seward's Washington, D.C. room. He's posed as a delivery boy for a doctor, as Seward had been wounded in a carriage accident 9 days before. Once he gains entry to the house, he goes on to wound 5 people in total, bludgeoning Frederick Seward over the head with a Navy pistol after the gun initially misfires. This will be so horrific and so bad that Frederick Seward needs a metal plate instilled in his skull. Gus Seward will be stabbed several times as he wrestles Lewis Powell off of his father, eventually getting him out to the doorway where Lewis Powell will make his escape. Seward is described by the attending physician as being gutted like a fish, his cheek and neck severely cut. So this attack by Lewis Powell will wound 5 people in total. And bearing witness to it all will be Seward's youngest child, the aspiring author, Fanny Seward, who had been reading to her wounded father when Lewis Powell first barges in. Now, Fanny Seward would bear witness to it all, keep a very detailed journal entry that allows historians to know what that chaotic scene looks like. As for Lewis Powell, after initially escaping, he's quickly captured by the federal government and sentenced to execution. And that, again, kind of starts that year of tragedy for the Seward family, which is perfectly captured by this portrait here. Now, here we see Fanny Seward. There's some symbolism in it which might seem strange. Things like the downward bouquet, the flowers that are about to fall from her hands, her very pale, almost ghost-like left hand. Next to her are morning glories, which are flowers that bloom quickly and die out quickly as well. It's fall behind her, a season where living things begin to perish, and it's overcast. It doesn't look like a day you'd want to be painted outside, but she is peering into that only break in the sky, which was used to let visitors know she was off to a better place. This is a posthumous portrait completed after she passes away. And that symbolism seems strange to us. If this was Seward's great unspeakable sorrow, why would he want to be bludgeoned by reminders of his daughter's death every time he looked at this portrait? And that's because the purpose of this room, along with being a family space, this was again a spot used for family entertainment. So visitors making their way into this space might be familiar with Seward as a political figure, but they might not know what had happened to Fanny. So this symbolism would let them know that this was a delicate subject, and perhaps something not best to bring up in polite conversation. Now, one last Seward who I should point out, to the left of Fanny Seward, you'll see her older brother, Will Jr., though the youngest of the 3 sons born to the family. Will Jr. will serve during the Battle of Monocacy, a fight where Union troops are outnumbered 3-1. He'll have his horse shot out from underneath him, suffer a broken leg, and following his service in the Battle of Monocacy, he's promoted to Brigadier General. He goes on to run 2 banks here in Auburn, serve on the board of American Express, so Will Jr. does quite well for himself. And eventually this house will be left to him, and finally to Will III, before it's donated to become a museum, which is why we're lucky enough to have this collection here. Now, we've just walked through the first level of the house, kind of exploring the history, being introduced to the Seward family. And as you walk through it, they might seem a little bit distant. This is certainly a time set in the 19th century, but there's one space that we like to wrap our tours with, which really connect with them and let us know what they were truly about. So if you'll follow me. We are in the original kitchen of the house, which upon first sight really isn't that much, especially when you compare it to the grandeur of the upstairs. This is, again, the original kitchen when the house was first built. So the dining room that we saw upstairs, the food wouldn't have been prepared down here for that. It would have been almost impossible to make 12 courses of food for 12 to 24 people down here and bring it all the way upstairs and the dishes down here. So what ends up happening is when Seward makes the addition that adds the dining room upstairs, the kitchen, similarly, would be moved to the first story of the floor, where our gift shop is today. And then this would essentially become dead space that wasn't being used by the family, until the 1850s with the passing of the Fugitive Slave Act, which made it federal law that it was illegal to help someone who had liberated themselves or who was running away from slavery make their way north to eventual freedom in Canada. So during this time, the space wasn't being used by the family. During the 1850s, as breaking federal law, Francis Seward spearheads using the stop as a station on the Underground Railroad. So it's here that self-liberated individuals, again running away from slavery from the South, making their way north, would be able to receive a meal, perhaps a night's sleep before continuing their way further north. And that concludes our tour. So hopefully when all of this clears up, you'll be able to visit us in person. But thanks for attending this virtual tour. If you have any questions about anything you saw during the tour today, feel free to reach out to me. Again, my name is Zach, and I can be reached at outreach@sewardhouse.org. But stay safe, stay healthy, everyone. Have a good one.